Welcome to the Serve Campus Podcast. This is a resource for campus ministry workers across Canada, providing inspiration, education, and coaching for people leading ministries on post-secondary campuses. Our goal is to encourage and resource you in your vital work on universities, colleges, institutes, wherever you are. We hope you enjoy the show today. Grab a cup of coffee and have fun listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I hope our time together really helps you think creatively about serving and enriching your ministry among students, faculty, and staff on post-secondary campuses. Our question for those who are listening is, how can we help to better engage your campus? Well, we hope this podcast will help answer that in some key way for you today. Hey, we're excited to have Dan Collado with us today. And Dan is the academic director for the Aboriginal Bible Academy and Indigenous Canadians National Director with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. And Dan has done a few sessions with us for our campus ministry staff in the past few months, but we're really glad that you can join us for this podcast.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, I think about the first time that we met, Dan. I think it was almost 2 years ago. We were competing against each other, I think with some axe throwing, if I remember right.
That's right.
Yeah, and as I remember, you were really good. We were giving you a hard time about that. But you began your role as national coordinator. When was that?
That would have been like the fall of 2019, since I've been the Indigenous Canadians coordinator.
Okay, that's right. And that's what I was thinking, because I started my role about that same time. Well, Dan, it's so good again to have you with us. We sure appreciate and respect the work that you're doing with Indigenous peoples. And can you just share with us about maybe how you got into these roles that you're now in?
Sure. Yeah. Along with Aboriginal Bible Academy and being the director overseer of that ministry, been in that role since 2009. And then, of course, we're just mentioning about the Indigenous Canadians coordinator role with under Mission Canada with PAOC. That was in the fall of 2019. Although I am Indigenous myself, my grandmother was born and raised on the Bay of Quinte Mohawk the Mohawk territory of Tyendinaga, which is like 2 hours east of Toronto, Ontario. So I have that heritage. That is my band that I belong to on territory. But my involvement with Indigenous ministry, which is now moving over 25 years, has really had nothing to actually do with my heritage. I'd have to say that back in probably January of 1993, I had my own kind of personal come to Jesus moment where I wrestled with God, if you will. I come from a lengthy line of Pentecostals. My grandparents, great-grandparents were Pentecostal. So I'm like fourth generation. And so I grew up with this wonderful Christian heritage that really I kind of took for granted. And my spiritual walk really kind of subsisted on riding on the coattails of that spiritual heritage. And I didn't need to personally trust God for much, because everyone else in the family kind of did that for me. But I had graduated from Bible college in 1990, and for 3 years I really felt like my life was just kind of spinning in neutral, and almost unconsciously I had kind of placed a limit on what I thought God could do through me. And it wasn't until I kind of had enough of myself and I prayed this, I prayed this simple prayer. And I said, God, if I'm willing to go wherever there's a need that you think I can help meet. And just that simple prayer, what had been like after 3 years of practically nothing, within days of praying that prayer, I'm telling you, divine appointments really began to open up for both mine and my wife's life. And these opportunities always just seem to be of Indigenous in nature. And really that prayer has kind of kept me on track and tracking forward to this day, as within my role as ABA and with Mission Canada.
Wow, that's such a key piece, being willing to go and meet needs, go where the hurt is, in other words. And that prayer is a wonderful prayer for all of us to pray. So thanks for sharing that. That's great. Well, this question has to do with the context that we're in today with Indigenous peoples, and of course the hundreds of children who never made it home, and more graves are being found. Well, what is significant about understanding the Indigenous worldview for Christians?
That's a great question, John, and it's an important question because I think in order to know and to truly understand someone, you need to know what's important to them. And one of the things that I suggest to those that perhaps are not familiar with the Indigenous context or Indigenous people is to not come with the assumption that Indigenous people are all the same, because all Indigenous people are not the same across the country. Although Indigenous people can often share some core values, right, and will have similar themed worldviews. The fact of the matter is, Mohawks are not Cree. Cree are not Blackfoot. Blackfoot are not Inuit. Inuit are not Innu. And you can further go through each one of the nations. But Indigenous people do share a common thread of identity as First Peoples in this land, as well as sharing a value of really being caretakers and not owners of creation. Indigenous people, whether they're Christian or not, they have a firm belief in Creator. And they'll often see themselves as part of the environment, right? Not above it. And they're seen, or we see ourselves as being in position or being put in a position by Creator as having this great responsibility to not upset the balance that's so evident within nature. And I think that principle in itself goes a long way in shaping how an Indigenous person not only interacts, obviously, with the natural environment, but how they will go about interacting with other people. And of course, the spirit realm.
Fascinating. And that whole understanding that they're part of the environment, I think there's a gospel thread there, is there not?
Absolutely.
It seems like God has built the gospel thread into almost every culture. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a keen sense of divine appointment, if you will, the significance of being in existence for the Indigenous person, that it's not just simply a random act of the collocation of atoms where things just kind of happened and I have no purpose in my life. There's a very theistic understanding and view of existence, and that there's a purpose that has been given to humanity, and then specifically from an Indigenous point of view, the Indigenous person feels that there's a role that they play within that environment, that they are part of the process of the web of interconnectedness, for bringing about the propagation and prosperity of all of creation. And so there's not this sense of we're above it, but we're part of it. And it really comes with a strong sense of responsibility, much of as what God declared to both Adam and Eve, in being caretakers of this creation. And for Indigenous people, that's just been a natural extension of everything that has kind of happened, up to this point. The existence is about being in that relationship with environment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I know there's so much there to unpack. But so let's talk about this cultural moment that we're in. And what is your take with where we're at today with Indigenous peoples and all that is happening, with the injustice of the past, with the church being a part of this, the government being a part of this? What's your take?
Yeah. It's been a difficult journey for many, for many Canadians, regardless of, your ethnicity, your cultural background. I truly believe that we are at a crossroads here within Canada regarding, First Peoples and Canadian relations. We are being faced with a swell of public discontent with the status quo. And really, people are no longer willing to be kind of placated by nice sounding words and the promise that, well, it'll get better. Or even the idea that, well, this was so long ago, let's move on. I think we're really seeing a swell of angst, if you will, it's manifesting itself with, like rallying cries to burn it all down in some cases. And I mean, that's been currently happening, not just figuratively either. It's been happening literally. And I trust that we all know that, that's not the ultimate answer. But, when people are not at peace with themselves, how can we expect them to be at peace with anybody or anything else? And, I'm reminded as I say that it was James 4, has told us that kind of asked that rhetorical question, where do wars and quarrels come from? Well, they come from the battles that rage within. And I think that the Canadian or the Christian community has a real opportunity here to step up and into the Indigenous narrative, to step up into the hurt, to step up into what's currently being spoken and wrestled with, and ask to hear the stories and ask to hear the journey and to be part of that process of positioning ourselves well to listen. These things have happened, because of long-standing, be it injustice, long-standing disconnect in relationship. And relationship doesn't just snap back into, proper alignment. And so we're going to be needing to be willing, that is the Christian community is going to need to be willing to put in the time to proclaim Jesus in such a manner that speaks louder than what has historically been presented in the name of Jesus.
Right. That is crucial. And you alluded to that. I've heard you talk about listening, But there's two other L's that you mentioned in the past talks and sessions that I've been in: looking and learning and
Yes.
listening. Can you talk about that in terms of the context of
Sure.
what the Christian church must be about?
Yeah. I know within the Christian context, the church context, we can feel quite confident in knowing that we have the answer, and so the church can often portray itself in that manner, as we have the answer. The answer is Jesus, and sometimes we try to portray, project, to proclaim that message of truth before we have a right to be heard, before we actually know the context in which we're speaking in and sharing that. It is true, but if we share that truth without understanding the context of who we're speaking with, the truth can be misunderstood. And so there's a real need for the church, for the Christian community to look, in other words, to be observant, to watch, and to kind of see what the context is that they find themselves in, or the context is that they're wanting to minister to or speak in. And sometimes, we can be a little too much in a hurry, a little too brash to share the truth that we know before we've fully understood the best way of sharing it. And sometimes we just have to look. We just have to take that time, and then to listen. Not just be observant, but then to take the opportunity, because the fact is, this is how all relationships work. If one person is always doing the talking, if one person is always kind of given, here are the points, here's the truth, here's the way it should be, that's not healthy. It's not going to last. There's going to be a certain level of dysfunction within that. And I think sometimes, as the church, in our boldness with having the truth, we haven't taken the time yet to listen to what the actual needs are. We just know that the answer to the needs is Jesus. But if we're presenting the answer in the wrong way, it's counterproductive. And so there needs to be that need to look, to listen. And then obviously from those two things of learning, or from looking, the listening, you begin to learn, you begin to understand more fully who it is that you're speaking to, their history, their context, their culture. And so that really the same lesson can be about, one-to-one interaction to, one culture to another culture. We need to look, listen, and learn.
Yeah. So good, Dan. To build onto that, are there a couple of resources that you have found very helpful, whether podcasts or book or articles?
Well, certainly, specifically concerning Indigenous ministries, I know there's been a gentleman named, now his name has just escaped me. The title of the book is White Man's Gospel. Craig Smith. Yes, Craig Smith. It's an older work. It was perhaps one of the more poignant books that I read early on, in kind of like my general ministry life. He's an Indigenous author. It's coming from an American context. And like I said, it's a bit dated, but the concepts in there concerning Indigenous relationships, I found impactful for my own life, even being Indigenous myself. And I know that it did influence me as to how to begin to to recognize the differences in culture, and yet seeing how beautifully the Indigenous culture is so similar to the early and ancient beginnings of Christianity, coming from Judaism and a tribal culture itself. It's just there's more within Christianity that brings together the existence of life for the Indigenous person than actually what separates. And so that's why it's so painful when I, in the name of the church and in the name of Jesus, there's been such tragedy that has happened. And so the name of the book is White Man's Gospel. The idea that, it's so foreign, that's white man's God. And yet the book kind of really points to how similar, with the Hebrew people coming from that tribal culture, same as the Indigenous people. And there's really so much more similar than what is dissimilar. And it's just unfortunate that our church history has done a disservice to how much Indigenous people would naturally identify with Christianity.
Sure. Yeah. And let's talk about what can be done. What do we need to know as a church about the Indigenous understanding for reconciliation?
Well, for Indigenous people, it really, the journey, the process is just as important as the destination, the end result. I think that the process of reconciliation cannot be thought of in transactional terms. It's not simply an event where, okay, there's a giving and a receiving of forgiveness, and now, okay, everything is good, right? That's a transactional exchange of goods and services. And the thing is, reconciliation is not a one and done type of commodity, but instead it's an ongoing process where you've got two parties, right? Whether it's a group or two individuals, but those two parties, they agree to journey together from this point onward, and it's a relational commitment towards really having a genuine interest and care for each other. And I think that the Christian community, that the church needs to position itself to be receptive with this relationship model and be willing to put in the time to build relationships. I think that the church, we've become quite a juggernaut and quite efficient in proclaiming gospel. We have our methods and methodology and the devices we use and programs that we use to propagate the gospel, to be evangelists, but we haven't always been the best at the journey and walking with others. We've got the commodity, we have the answer, and we want to give it to the people. Sometimes that's just not going to be received until there is a full, robust relationship there. And that, to the Indigenous person, reconciliation is relationship.
Yeah, that's right. To go with that, what has the PAOC done in terms of moving toward reconciliation? So there are some steps that have taken place, and maybe some current kinds of examples of what's happening at that level.
Sure. Well, I know in 2012 at the PAOC's General Conference that was held in Ottawa, it was a timely kind of time for this event to have happened, but there was a public apology through the PAOC leadership of that time. along with the Indigenous representatives within the fellowship of the POC, where there was a giving and receiving of forgiveness. Apologies were exchanged concerning, what had transpired in the past. There was a felt need that the POC needed to kind of address certainly the historical atrocities that had happened, within Canada regarding Indigenous people, specifically, the residential schools and things of that nature. But there had always kind of been this underlying kind of sense of, well, the POC wasn't actually one of the churches or denominations that was directly involved with that. But there was a need for Indigenous leadership to say, you know what, I think POC needs to address the fact that they really didn't do anything to speak out against those atrocities. And so it was kind of like the sin of omission. And so that was addressed, and there was, along with that forgiveness and apology, there was a commitment in that statement to also walk together in newness, a relationship as equals, and the desire of being partners in with Christ for the kingdom of God. So that kind of transpired in 2012, and that was at a national level, and trickling from that, there had been as kind of district and regional areas sought fit within their local context. There were further kind of public addressing of this within, various bodies of the POC, like I said, within districts and then local contexts, that churches. And that kind of stretched across various regions of the rest of Canada within our districts. But even ongoing now to this day, of course, under Mission Canada, of course, there's the Indigenous Guiding Group that works towards bringing a voice, a national voice for Indigenous needs, bringing awareness to the rest of the fellowship regarding Indigenous ministries and initiatives. But there's been, I know, certainly a bit more of an uptake now since the recent revelations there in Kamloops back in late May. There's been increased conversations at local levels, churches looking at how, and I've been kind of I've been getting a lot of those calls, and people calling in, churches, even district superintendents, just asking kind of, what are some things that can be done here, both at a regional and local levels. Like I know local churches asking what some of the conversations that we can have in addressing these things. It's one thing to know that a tragedy has happened, but it's been encouraging to see how churches are wanting to know, okay, what can we do now? What should we be doing now? And so that's been, really one of the key conversations that have been happening. And those have been popping up right across, not just on a district-wide, but really nationally. This has been happening.
That's very encouraging, really. And is there one or two stories that come to mind with what's happening in those locales?
Yeah, well, I know that one church, they've asked a couple of times, have been kind of reached out to me, just asking. We have a community that's kind of near us, on the outskirts of our town, and just kind of asking for a bit of guidance as to what they could do. Part of it had to do with, okay, how can we tastefully respond and show our concern for the recent news from Kamloops, but it was that was kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And then it was like, okay, how can we then journey forward from this? So it's not just about, how do you tactfully say, oh, I send my condolences, as a church body to you about this, but actually wanting and interested in developing dialogue and a relationship with Indigenous people. I've been actually asked to go to this one church and kind of meet with their leadership and just talk about some Indigenous realities and what are some ways that could be done within their local context as to help to us begin establish a relationship. And so hearing these kinds of interests has just been it's been so encouraging to me, because I know that for many people across Canada, this has been a complete shock of these revelations of these unmarked graves. And unfortunately, those of us within the Indigenous context have been well aware of these things, perhaps maybe not actual numbers specifically, but there had been rumors and suspicions across Canada concerning this, that, and the other thing, with different residential school areas. And to see it finally coming to light has just helped kind of bring, much of Canada up to date with what many people within the Indigenous context have known, for decades. And so it's an opportunity to now have heartfelt conversations about, well, what do we do now?
Right.
And there's no easy answers. There's not a quick fix with this. But, it's unfortunate, but it seems to be human nature that it takes tragedy to kind of really get us to sit up and take notice and to be willing to work together, to spend time with one another and kind of work through some things. But if this is what it takes, then this is what it takes. And as the church, we need to be leading by example, being willing to lead the charge, to look, listen, and learn.
Yeah, so good. And it is a humbling moment for us, but really, I think that's one of the keys of the gospel, that as we humble ourselves, forgiveness, reconciliation, and all those things can be turned toward a new future. And so I'm really, really happy and actually just glad to be a part of a fellowship that believes and lives that out. Let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about the post-secondary context and what are some important things to know about Indigenous people and post-secondary education.
Right. Yeah. Well, regarding secondary education. Although this is, kind of slowly balancing out, statistically, the Indigenous demographic is still the least likely to complete high school or to pursue post-secondary education. So I think you can kind of you can see how that can pose a bit of an obstacle for even my specific role within Aboriginal Bible Academy. Those of the the younger generation that do go on to pursue post-secondary education, many actually don't return to the reserve, and so the local community can tend to kind of struggle somewhat sometimes with finding enough qualified workers with the skill set to kind of like raise the overall quality in some instances. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. Many communities are in a much better condition than things were, but that progression, I would say, has happened at a snail's pace. The thing is, we're not seeing, many Indigenous people relative to the rest of Canada pursuing post-secondary education. Yet, having said that, it's one of the youngest populations. Like the average age is less than 25, is about 24. Population-wise, birth rate is like 2.5 times that of the rest of Canada. So currently, there's about 5% of of Canada's population is Indigenous. It's only going to increase. And there was a statistic that was talked about concerning like young adult and that post-secondary age group, that by 2020, so this was a study done in 2017, so it's a bit dated now, but they're suggesting that by 2020 there was going to be an estimated shortfall of 1 million workers in Canada, mostly in the high-skilled and knowledge-oriented occupations. And I'll read this direct quote: "The current labor shortfall has already impacted businesses and operations." But it's saying how in Canada, the Aboriginal population is looking at, it says, in the next 15 years, more than 400,000 Aboriginal young people will reach the labor market age. So we have this young Indigenous population where some are going to post-secondary and college, university, but many are not, and yet they're reaching and becoming into that labor market and coming into that age demographic that becomes quite influential with, who our leaders are going to be. Right, these youth, they need to be ready for the job market, and yet sometimes there can be, this large discrepancy with those that are pursuing education, and those that aren't. And I just think that the Christian community, and speaking specifically concerning campus ministry, an Indigenous person within within a professional field has a strong, powerful influence, and it is vital that they be reached for Christ. They are looked up to amongst their people for having positions of influence within, say, the white world, and they need the gospel. They need the gospel of Christ. They need to have that hope of Jesus within them, or else we'll continue to see kind of this rift developing within the professional sectors of those that are educated and Indigenous, with having progressive ideas that are anti-Christian. And campus ministry has a potentially key part to play with those diamonds, those Indigenous diamonds that exist within our post-secondary institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what makes Jesus and the gospel appeal to Indigenous people?
I'm really glad that you asked that question, John, because I don't know if your audience for this this podcast is solely Pentecostal, but I've always said for the longest time that Indigenous people make the best Pentecostals, because they're just naturally supernatural. There's already a deeply embedded spirituality within the Indigenous mindset. having a very robust understanding of creator and creation and, humanity's relationship with those two realities. And I think that recognition can sometimes often be missing within typical North American culture. But here's the thing. I think whereas, the incarnation of Jesus, God becoming man, can be such a stumbling block, I think, to many with a progressive anti-theistic understanding of existence. For the typical Indigenous person, even especially those perhaps who are steeped in traditional Native religion, they would really have less problem believing that God coming in the form of the man Jesus, right? Because within Indigenous spirituality, spirits are constantly manifesting themselves in physical forms, and so that's not a foreign concept. It's just the difficulty comes, when a person who already has a preconception of the Christian God, and so an Indigenous person comes into that conversation having already this past experience of what the Christian God is or represents. And so there's sometimes this need to kind of strip away those misconceptions first. But I think what can really resonate with Indigenous people is the understanding that God originally chose to reveal himself to mankind through a tribal culture, the Hebrew people. And this would resonate very strongly with Indigenous people, and how Christ's lineage can actually be traced back to those roots. And so there is, I think, much within Christianity that is just naturally appealing to the Indigenous person. We just need to be willing to patiently work through kind of some of the mistakes that have been made in the past in the name of Christ, over the years, right? To reveal the real Jesus.
Yeah, and again, what an amazing gospel thread. I was just writing that concept down, that God revealed himself to a tribal culture.
Yeah.
And that's built in.
Yeah.
With the
Yeah.
Indigenous
Now, tribal culture has its pitfalls. We all know the dangers of tribalism. This idea of we can really kind of surround ourselves and circle ourselves with a wall that is very familiar to us, and we keep within those walls. And tribalism can lead to that. But it is interesting, and certainly that the Jews were guilty of that, and with the with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. I mean, it took another God intervention with the Holy Spirit to empower the people to break beyond those barriers. And even still, the Apostle Peter, he struggled with that, and Apostle Paul had to kind of correct him on those things concerning contextualizing things. And but it still, he used that built-in tribalism within Judaism to expose the world to the existence and the reality and the supremacy of God. And then, of course, ultimately, we see it being done through Jesus, who again came through that lineage of that tribal culture. And so, yeah, there's a lot there for the Indigenous person to grab a hold of.
Yeah, Dan, so good. Hey, I'm wondering if there's a resource that you could just share with us a little bit about.
Sure. Yeah. One of the resources that we use quite extensively within my role with Aboriginal Bible Academy, it's a resource that we have available. It's called the Native Book of Hope. It's based on the Book of Hope. It was a creation out of the United States, where it has really the synoptic gospels, if you will, the story of Jesus in the latter half of the book. But what differentiates this resource from the Book of Hope, the native Book of Hope, has at the beginning a collection of stories of hope from present day Indigenous people from both across North America, so both US and Canada. There's called Stories of Hope. They're testimonies of individuals who have kind of went through life-controlling addictions and situations and how they overcome it through the power of Jesus Christ, the Creator. And so what it actually does, many of the stories will then link the reader from after having read that story. Here's one on addiction and victory over addiction. It then gives the opportunity for the reader to go to another section of the book, and then it takes them to the Synoptic Gospels, where that reader can then read of how Jesus dealt with a similar situation. So it takes a present day situation with a present day individual and links that reality to Jesus Christ, who, often people will consider him some historical figure, but he was someone from the past. But it really brings the presentness of Jesus to today. And even in some of, at the end of a section, it'll give a simple kind of fill in the blank question answer opportunity for that reader to kind of reflect on kind of some of the concepts that have been that they've been reading. But one of the things is if a person was to read this from cover to cover, they would get the presentation of the gospel 5 times throughout its content. And it actually, the cover of it has faces of 7 Indigenous people, which represents kind of the 7 generation kind of motif that many Indigenous cultures adhere to, this idea that the past, present, and future all happening at once. They're always thinking of 7 generations from the past to 7 generations in the future. And so there's always this continuity of the past and the future are always present in the now. And so anyway, it's just been, I know, a very helpful resource for those that are a nice, gentle evangelism tool. It's not overbearing, but it's for those that are kind of seeking and searching and looking for hope. And it's written by Indigenous, for Indigenous specifically, but I know that many people have kind of enjoyed that process of going through that book.
That's fantastic. And where can our listeners connect with you about that if they were interested in getting the Book of Hope? Yeah,
sure. Well, from our website, this is aboriginalbibleacademy.ca. It's one of the resources that we have. And from that website, you can connect with me. Our contact information is there, but also my email is director@aboriginalbibleacademy.ca, and you can email me about that, or you can even call at 613-344-1703, and that'll reach me here at the office of ABA. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much, and we'll include that information in the show notes. But Dan, it's been such a delight to engage in these questions, and again, I learn every time that I'm with you, and so appreciate your heart to meet needs and to serve Indigenous peoples. If anyone does want to connect with you, again, we will provide that in our show notes. So thanks everybody for being with us today. We'll be back again in the next show to interview a campus worker that you all know, whose name we won't yet reveal, but you're going to enjoy what she has to say. Okay, that's all for today. And we pray that what has been shared by Dan will stir your thinking about how to practically serve students, faculty, and staff on your campus.